Every dawn, her rusted pickup slips into construction sites, loading splintered offcuts, nail-holed planks, and warped beams that nobody wanted. For 15 years, the town called her the scrap collector, and the bank started foreclosing on her workshop. Then a chair, 17 species of salvaged wood, joints flawless, won the nation's highest craft award. Suddenly, galleries fought over the woman they had dismissed. What did she see? If you love stories about hidden treasure, subscribe. Clarissa Embele was invisible. For 15 years, she gathered scrap wood, broke, facing foreclosure, ignored by an entire town. Then a chair she built from 17 different salvaged species won the country's highest craft award. The question that drives her story isn't how she built it. It's what she saw in that discarded timber that nobody else did. Years before that chair ever touched a gallery floor, Clarissa Embele was just the daughter of a dead carpenter in a village that had already decided her future was behind a market stall, not behind a workbench. Her father, Joseph Embele, had been the man you went to for a chair that would outlast your grandchildren. He built each piece as if the wood was still alive and deserving of respect. He taught Clarissa nothing about joinery, not out of cruelty, but because in his world, daughters were not apprentices. When he died of a heart condition that the local clinic caught too late, she inherited his small workshop, a rusted band saw, a cottage with a leaking roof, and a bank loan he had taken against the property that she had no way to repay. The foreclosure notice arrived exactly 11 months after the funeral. She had spent those months trying to sell off his finished inventory, but the furniture was too traditional for the city buyers, and the villagers had their own tables. The bank was patient but not endlessly so. The loan officer, a man named Jeffrey, told her she had 6 months before the auction. "Sell what you can," he said, and glanced around the workshop with the expression of someone subtracting value from every corner. Clarissa's cousin warned her to move back to her mother's homestead before she embarrassed the family. Neighbors at the village market tightened their smiles and looked past her shoulder. The children called her Chuma Chakavu, scrap metal, though her truck was always loaded with wood, not iron. She never corrected them. The name stuck like dust. What they didn't know was that a library book from the district capital, a worn hardback titled *The Art of Joinery* with a spine so cracked the pages fell out in sections, had become her lifeline. She had found it in a second-hand bin for 50 shillings. Every night after the market closed, she sat under a single bulb and traced the diagrams with her finger. She learned about mortise and tenon, dovetail, dowel joints, and the patience required to make timber yield. She couldn't afford new lumber, so she rose before dawn and drove to construction sites, loading splintered offcuts that the crews had thrown away. Warped beams, planks riddled with carpenters' mistakes, nail holes like scars. She sorted them by color and grain in the back shed, a library of rejection that she read by moonlight. She made her first chair 4 years after her father's death, from a mahogany offcut and a piece of teak that had been a door frame. It was crude and proud, a thing she hid under a tarp when visitors came. She made 20 chairs before she made one she could bear to look at. By then the bank had granted 2 extensions, and the villagers had settled into the comfortable story that Joseph's daughter had lost her mind along with her prospects. Nobody ever asked what she was building. They assumed she was too strange to produce anything of worth. Then the National Craft and Design Awards announced an open call. The entry fee was 500 shillings, exactly half of what she had saved for a new roof. She paid it anyway and began work on a chair unlike any she had attempted before. She would use 17 different species of salvaged wood, every piece a fragment of a place that had thrown something away. The joints had to be invisible, faultless, because the wood would reveal every mistake. She worked for weeks, the deadline looming, the foreclosure date circled on a calendar she kept under her pillow. The night before the submission, she sanded the final curve of the armrest until her fingers cramped, and then she wrapped the chair in a torn bedsheet and carried it to the post office at dawn. She told no one, and then she waited, while the bank's final notice sat unopened on her table. The letter from the National Craft and Design Awards arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the workshop door by a postal carrier who had no idea what he was delivering. Clarissa opened it with flour-dusted hands, expecting a polite rejection printed on thin paper. Instead, she read the words "grand prize" 3 times before the meaning settled. Her chair, the one she had built from 17 different species of discarded wood, the one she had wrapped in a torn bedsheet and mailed without telling a soul, had won the highest honor in the country. The award carried a cash prize of 200,000 shillings and an exhibition in the capital. She sat down on the workshop floor and wept into her apron for a full 10 minutes. Then she remembered the bank notice still unopened on the kitchen table. She had 3 days before the foreclosure auction went final. The news reached the village before she could walk to the market. A reporter from the National Arts Desk had already called the district commissioner's office for comment, and word spread in the way small-town word always does, through a neighbor's cousin's phone call, through a market vendor who overheard and repeated with embellishment. By noon, the woman they had called the scrap collector for 15 years was the lead story on the country's largest radio bulletin. The headline they used was not about the chair, it was about the wood. 17 species, all salvaged, all thrown away. The detail caught fire. People wanted to understand the technical achievement, but they also wanted to understand her. How had a woman with no formal training, no mentor, no money, built something the judges described as a masterclass in joinery that belongs in the international conversation? Everyone suddenly wanted an answer. The village, which had spent a decade and a half averting its eyes, found itself at the center of a story it had never bothered to learn. Her cousin was the first to arrive at the workshop, wearing an expression that mixed pride with the embarrassment of someone realizing they had bet on the wrong horse. She offered to help manage the sudden attention, to polish Clarissa's image before the cameras arrived. Clarissa thanked her and sent her away without a commitment. She had 15 years of silence to measure against 15 minutes of sudden interest, and the math did not balance. The neighbor who had complained most loudly about the truckloads of scrap stood at the edge of the property that afternoon, squinting at the workshop as if seeing it for the first time. He didn't approach. He just stood there, arms crossed, and then walked back to his house without a word. Clarissa noticed, because she had learned to notice everything over years of being watched as a curiosity rather than a person. The bank officer, Jeffrey, called that evening. His voice had changed completely. The same man who had enumerated the value of her liquidation 2 weeks earlier was now asking whether she might need an extension for restructuring. He mentioned the cash prize as if it were a number she might have forgotten. Clarissa listened, said she would visit the branch tomorrow, and hung up without thanking him. The power in that silence was something she had never tasted before, and she found it both intoxicating and deeply sad. The system that had tried to erase her was now scrambling to keep her in its ledger. Gallery interest arrived faster than the paperwork. By Wednesday, 3 different curators from the capital had sent urgent inquiries. One offered to buy the chair outright for 3 times the prize money, sight unseen. Another proposed an exclusive representation deal that would place her work in private collections across the continent. A European buyer, reached by a contact in the awards committee, asked whether she could produce more pieces using the same salvaged approach, framing it as an artisanal narrative of reclamation. Clarissa had never heard the word artisanal used to describe her before. She had only ever been someone who refused to let good wood go to waste. Now she was a brand, a story, a profile waiting to be written. The gap between who she had been the previous morning and who she was now felt less like a bridge and more like a cliff she had been pushed across while half asleep. But here is the thing nobody in the village knew, and nobody in the galleries could have guessed. That chair was not just a technical achievement. It was an answer to a question her father had asked her the night before he died, a question she had been too young to understand and too wounded to revisit until she held a chisel in her hand and finally felt the wood push back. Joseph Mbele, the man who never trained a daughter, had left something behind in that workshop that she did not find until the 10th year of her solitude, a small locked box hidden inside a hollow beam above the workbench. Inside was a set of chisels he had sharpened the morning of his heart attack, each blade wrapped in oiled cloth, and a letter written in his careful carpenter's hand. The letter explained that he had wanted to teach her, but the elders had forbidden it. They said a woman's place was not in the workshop, and he had been too weak to defy them. "Learn anyway," the letter read. "The wood will teach you if you let it." She had read that letter 500 times in the years that followed, and not once had she told anyone about it. The 17 species in her chair were not random. Each wood type came from a job her father had completed in his lifetime. The mahogany from a church pew, the teak from a schoolmaster's doorframe, the olive from a marriage bed he built for a couple who still slept on it 40 years later. She had gathered the scraps from the descendants of those projects, from demolition sites and renovation piles, and joined them into a single piece that carried the entire lineage of a man who could not give her his knowledge directly but had left it scattered across the village anyway. The judges had praised the joinery. They had no idea the joinery was a family reunion. When Clarissa walked into the bank branch the next morning, Jeffrey stood behind his desk and extended a hand she did not shake. She placed the award letter on his desk and asked a single question. "Is my debt cleared, or do I need to find another buyer?" He looked at the letter, then at her, then at the line of customers who had turned to watch. The auction was canceled before she left the building, but the moment of triumph was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something much harder. Because within a week, a demand arrived that threatened to strip away not just the chair, but the very idea that she had any right to the legacy she had spent 15 years rebuilding. The demand arrived in a brown envelope with no return address, hand-delivered by a boy on a bicycle who pedaled away before she could ask where it came from. Inside, a single sheet of paper, handwritten in careful block capitals. The sender was Thomas Embele, her father's younger brother, a man she had met exactly once at the funeral and not seen since. The letter stated that under customary law, the workshop, the cottage, and every tool inside were part of the Embele family's male lineage, and that her continued occupation was an act of trespass. She was given 14 days to vacate. She read the paragraph twice, then turned the paper over as if there might be a punchline on the back. There was. The timing was surgical. The gallery in the Capitol had just announced a public viewing of the award-winning chair. Media vans were parked outside her gate. Jeffrey at the bank had stamped the loan as satisfied that very morning. And now, a relative, she didn't remember having had found a legal lever to pull her out of the picture entirely. The same villagers who had called her a scrap collector for 15 years were suddenly taking sides. Some called Thomas a vulture. Others, careful not to look her in the eye, murmured that perhaps tradition had a point. After all, Joseph Embele had never written a will. Clarissa had simply moved in, and the community had let her, but ownership was another matter. Thomas arrived on the 10th day, accompanied by 2 elders from the district council who wore their authority like starched collars. They convened a meeting in the shade of the baobab tree at the village center, and Clarissa was summoned, not invited. She brought her father's letter, the one she had found inside the hollow beam with the oiled chisels, and she read aloud the words, "Learn anyway. The wood will teach you if you let it." She told them about the 17 species, each one a chapter of her father's working life. She told them that she had spent a decade and a half picking through dumpsters while this same village averted its gaze. Now they wanted to tell her she had no right to the roof she had almost lost to the bank. Thomas didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "A letter is not a will. Sentiment is not ownership." One of the elders nodded and pronounced that the property should have passed to the nearest male heir upon Joseph's death. Clarissa's gender, her singleness, and her choice of trade were listed as aggravating factors. The ruling was not legally binding on its own, but it carried enough weight to freeze the gallery's purchase, spook the investors who had been circling, and reopen every question about her legitimacy. The scrap collector, it seemed, could win a national prize and still be told she didn't belong at the table. She walked back to the workshop alone, locked the door, and sat in the dark for a long time. The worst part was not the threat of losing the building. It was the suspicion, unspoken but gathering force, that perhaps her father had never intended her to stay, that the chisels were a consolation, not a bequeathal, that the letter meant nothing. She replayed every interaction she'd ever had with Joseph Mbele, searching for a clue and found none. But then she remembered something small, the hollow beam, the way he used to tap it twice with his knuckle when he entered the workshop, a gesture she'd thought was just habit. That night she climbed onto the workbench with a flashlight between her teeth and reached deeper inside the beam than she ever had before. Her fingers brushed against a small metal box, rusted and stuck. She worked it free for an hour. Inside was a leather-bound journal, every page filled in her father's hand, dates, clients, wood types, joinery notes, a record of 41 years of work. On the final page, dated the morning of his heart attack, a single paragraph. My tools and my workshop go to my daughter Clarissa. She has the hands I never taught. She will learn without me. I wish I had been braver. Let no one say she has no right. This is my voice, if a voice is all I have left. It was signed with his full name and witnessed by a neighbor who had died years earlier. It was not a formal will, but it was a declaration of intent, and it changed everything. The next morning, Clarissa took the journal to a young lawyer in the capital named Aisha Okolo, a woman who had built her practice defending widows and daughters against exactly this kind of customary land grab. Aisha read the journal in silence, then closed it and said, "This is not a guaranteed win. Customary courts are unpredictable, but if we can show that your father intended you to inherit and that the family's own delay in claiming the property proves bad faith, we have a fight." She filed an emergency motion to block any transfer of assets, including the chair itself, pending a full hearing. Thomas responded by escalating. He petitioned for an injunction to force the gallery to return the chair to the family, arguing that the wood used in its construction was harvested from family job sites and therefore constituted communal property. The gallery director, a Dutch expatriate who had spent 6 figures framing the chair for exhibition, sent a terse email to Clarissa. "We cannot hold the peace indefinitely. The buyer in Dubai is getting impatient. If the legal cloud does not lift within 3 weeks, the sale is void and you will be liable for our costs." The stakes had telescoped. Losing the workshop was no longer just about a roof. It was about the debt that would come due if the gallery pulled out, about the legal fees mounting by the day, about the media narrative shifting from scrap collector wins prize to family feud over fake heirloom. A national talk show ran a segment titled Tradition versus the Individual, and the studio audience was split down the middle, half cheering her defiance, the other half calling her an ungrateful woman who had shamed her bloodline. The cousin who had once promised to polish her image now went on camera and said she'd never believed the chair was Clarissa's own work. "Joseph must have helped her," she said, her voice quivering with rehearsed sympathy. "She's been telling herself stories for years." Clarissa watched the segment on her phone in Aisha's office, then set the phone face down and asked what came next. Aisha laid out the timeline. The hearing was set for the first week of the new year, barely 3 weeks away. They would need character witnesses, documentation of the property's history, and a clear narrative that could survive the customary court skepticism. Clarissa had exactly one asset that could turn the public and the judges in her favor: the chair, the 17 species. The story of why each piece mattered. But to use that story, she would have to reveal the full depth of her father's hidden mentorship, the journal, the beam, the years of silence. She would have to open the one door she had kept locked since the day of the funeral. The hearing was set. The gallery was watching, and the entire village, along with a nation that had once celebrated her, now waited to see whether Clarissa Mbele could prove that a woman raised on scrap could hold onto what was hers. She had 3 weeks to build a case out of memory and a dead man's diary, against an uncle who had never swung a hammer in his life but knew exactly which traditions to weaponize. If she lost, she wouldn't just lose the workshop. She would lose the right to say that the chair was her own, and the Dubai buyer had already made an offer that would vanish the moment the judge's gavel came down. The morning of the hearing, Clarissa arrived at the customary court in the district capital, carrying nothing but a leather-bound journal and a chair leg wrapped in burlap. She had not slept. Aisha met her on the courthouse steps, and told her the gallery's legal observer was already seated inside, and the Dubai buyer's representative was on a video call from a hotel room overlooking the marina. The room was packed. The elders who had once sided with Thomas sat in the front row, and the villagers who had called her scrap collector filled the benches behind them. The radio station that had broken her story 2 months earlier had sent a reporter who was already scribbling notes before the judge had even taken the bench. Clarissa looked across at Thomas, who wore a borrowed suit and the expression of a man who had been promised an inheritance he'd never earned. She felt no anger. She felt the same stillness she had learned in the workshop, waiting for glue to cure. The judge, a woman named Justice M. Wend, opened by summarizing the complaint. Thomas Mbele sought possession of the workshop, cottage, and all assets derived from Joseph Mbele's labor, including the prize-winning chair currently held in the National Gallery. His argument was straightforward. Under customary law, a daughter who never married and never learned the family trade could not inherit her father's workshop. Clarissa's lawyer called her as the first witness. She walked to the stand and placed the journal in front of the judge. She read aloud her father's final entry. "My tools and my workshop go to my daughter Clarissa. She has the hands I never taught. She will learn without me. I wish I had been braver. Let no one say she has no right. This is my voice, if a voice is all I have left." She then read the list of every species of wood he had ever worked, the clients he had served, the dates. She identified each of the 17 species in her chair and explained which of her father's projects they had come from. She traced a direct line from his hands to hers, invisible but undeniable. The room was silent. The reporters stopped writing. The elder who had nodded when Thomas made his claim uncrossed his arms. Justice M. Wend asked Thomas a single question. "Did you ever visit your brother's workshop while he was alive?" Thomas said he had not, because he lived in the West and his work kept him busy. She asked, "Did you ever provide any material support to your niece during the 15 years she occupied the property and paid its taxes?" He did not answer. Aisha stood and submitted the bank records, the tax receipts, the foreclosure notices, every document that proved Clarissa had carried the weight that the Mbele family had abandoned. Then she submitted the letter from the hollow beam, the one the elders had dismissed as not a will. She submitted a sworn statement from the neighbor who had cut the timber for the beam and confirmed Joseph's habit of hiding things in it. She submitted the testimony of the other neighbor, now deceased, who had witnessed the final journal entry. And she submitted a photograph of the chair, with a note from the gallery director confirming that 17 different species had been identified, and that the chair was an unprecedented technical achievement that could only have been produced by someone with an intimate, generational knowledge of local timber. Justice M. Wend recessed for 30 minutes. Clarissa sat on the courthouse steps, the burlap-wrapped chair leg resting across her knees like a sleeping child. When the court reconvened, the ruling was delivered without ceremony. The property belonged to Clarissa Mbele. The chair was hers, its proceeds were hers, and the Mbele family's claim was dismissed with prejudice. Thomas was ordered to pay her legal costs, a sum that would take him years to settle. The reporter's headline that evening read, "Scrap Collector Wins Again," and for the first time the phrase was not an insult but a coronation. The gallery called within the hour. The Dubai buyer had increased his offer. Clarissa accepted, but on 2 conditions. The chair would spend 1 month on public display in the village hall before being shipped overseas, and 10% of the proceeds would fund a carpentry workshop for girls in the district, named after Joseph Mbele. The gallery agreed. The village hall was not a gallery. It was a dusty room with a corrugated roof where election results were announced and wedding receptions were held. But for 1 month, the chair sat on a plinth in the center, lit by a single bulb, and people came from 3 counties to see it. The same neighbors who had looked away at the market now stood in line for an hour. Clarissa's cousin offered to lead tour. Clarissa let her, because the chair was big enough to carry that too. One detail no one expected. While preparing the chair for the village display, Clarissa discovered something inside the hollow of the seat rail. A tiny compartment, sealed with a plug of beeswax, contained a folded scrap of paper in her father's handwriting. Just 5 words. I knew you would find it. She had never seen that note before, which meant he had built the hiding place after she started hauling scrap, had watched her progress from wherever he was now, and had written a message for a moment he could not witness but had always believed would come. That paper, not the check from Dubai, not the court ruling, not the headlines, was the thing she framed and hung above the workbench. She hadn't just proven her worth to the world. She had proven it to a ghost, and in doing so, she had rewritten the story of what a scrap collector can become. Clarissa Embele's story was never really about a chair. It was about a way of looking at the world that most of us forget to practice. Value does not evaporate just because something appears broken, discarded, or past saving. It simply becomes harder for most people to see. The wood she pulled from dumpsters carried the same grain, the same strength, the same potential it had when it was first milled. What changed was the willingness of everyone around her to keep looking. She kept looking for 15 years. Somewhere, right now, there is a pile of something that everyone else has already written off. A skill you abandoned. A project that failed. A relationship that fractured, a person who was told they didn't belong. The difference between a scrap heap and a life's work is not always obvious, but every once in a while, someone stops, bends down, and sees what everyone else missed. Clarissa didn't just build a chair out of discarded wood. She built a life out of a discarded reputation, and that is a much harder thing to join. If this story reminded you that opportunity does not always arrive looking like one, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments about something you once overlooked that turned out to matter. Share this with someone who needs a reminder today that the messiest chances are sometimes the best ones. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching. Until next time, keep your eyes open. The thing everyone else calls scrap might be the beginning of something no one has imagined yet.